In a world where wealth and prejudice often decide who gets to live and who doesn't, one man's hidden truth changes everything. A driver, dismissed because of his skin color, carries the secret that could save the millionaire's dying baby. What unfolds is a breathtaking journey of courage, sacrifice, and love that proves true family is built not by blood, but by the choices we make. Stay with us, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust, class, and destiny. Victoria Hamilton had everything that money could buy, yet in the sterile corridors of the hospital, all her wealth and influence meant nothing. Her newborn daughter Isabella lay helpless in the incubator, her tiny chest rising and falling with fragile breaths, her body failing because of a rare liver condition. The machines beeped in rhythm, each sound a cruel reminder of the ticking clock that was running out on Isabella's life. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, their expressions heavy with defeat. They explained the odds with cold precision. Finding a compatible donor was nearly impossible, especially within the short time Isabella had left. Victoria, draped in luxury but crumbling inside, begged for another option, but their silence was her answer. For the first time, the woman who commanded boardrooms and politicians found herself powerless. Antonio Silva stood quietly at the back of the room, dressed in the uniform of a driver, his posture humble, his presence barely acknowledged. To Victoria and her world, he was invisible. A man meant only to open doors and carry luggage. Yet his eyes lingered on Isabella with a torment that few could see. Behind his calm exterior lay a secret that clawed at him every moment he watched the baby struggle for life. Antonio knew something no one else in that hospital suspected. He might be the one person who could save her. But revealing that truth meant shattering the careful disguise he had worn for years and risking ridicule, suspicion, and perhaps even his job. Memories pressed into him like ghosts from a life he had once lived. Long before he drove cars for the wealthy, Antonio had worn a white coat. He had been a brilliant medical student, sharp and ambitious, dreaming of becoming a surgeon. But the corridors of academia had not welcomed him kindly. He remembered the whispered comments from professors who doubted a poor black student belonged in their ranks, the way opportunities mysteriously vanished, and the way his research was credited to others while he was dismissed as unfit. The final blow came when he discovered he carried an extremely rare blood type, one that could save lives in unique circumstances. Instead of it being celebrated, it became another weapon against him. He was labeled too much trouble, and doors closed in his face. With no family, no connections, and no one willing to fight for him, Antonio abandoned his dream and sought work where no one asked questions, behind the wheel of a luxury car. Now, standing just feet from Isabella's crib, he felt those years of rejection burning in his chest. The doctors had declared it impossible to find a donor, yet he knew in his heart that his blood type could be the key. He had taken tests quietly without telling anyone, confirming his compatibility. But the truth left him paralyzed. Would Victoria, a woman who barely looked at him except to hand over her keys, believe he was sincere? Would the doctors laugh at him, dismiss his history as a lie from a desperate servant trying to gain favor? Fear wrapped around him like chains, whispering that silence was safer. Yet each shallow breath Isabella took seemed to cut through those chains. One night, as Victoria sat by her daughter's side, tears streaking her face in a rare moment of vulnerability, Antonio stepped forward. His voice trembled but carried a quiet conviction. He revealed his tests, explained his rare blood type, and offered himself as a donor. Victoria turned to him with a mixture of shock and suspicion, her eyes narrowing as though trying to see through a mask. To her, he was a driver, not a man of science, and his offer sounded impossible, even dangerous. The doctors were called in, their skepticism even sharper. They dismissed his words as foolishness, demanded proof of his education, and questioned his motives. Why would a man risk his life for a child that wasn't his? Why had he kept such a secret for so long? The hospital committee deliberated and quickly refused authorization. They insisted it was too risky, that Antonio's background was unverifiable, and that proceeding would open them to liability. To them, Isabella's fate was sealed, and Antonio's courage was an inconvenience. Victoria, torn between desperation and distrust, could only watch as the decision was handed down like a final verdict. Isabella's condition worsened with every passing hour, her small body losing strength, and the cold hands of inevitability closing in. Antonio walked away from that meeting with his head bowed, but inside, his resolve was hardening. He could no longer sit back and watch a child die when he carried the very answer within his own veins. If the system refused to see his worth, then he would act outside the system. For years, he had hidden his true self, living in the shadows of prejudice and silence. But now, as Isabella's life slipped closer to its end, Antonio knew that the time had come to step out of the shadows and risk everything. For her, and for the chance to finally prove that his life's purpose had never been lost, only waiting. Antonio sat alone in his small apartment, the city's lights flickering through the blinds like reminders of the choices he had yet to make. The hospital had refused his offer, the committee dismissing his willingness to save Isabella as reckless. Yet he couldn't let go. His heart pounded with the weight of time slipping away, each minute another nail in the coffin of a baby who had barely begun life. He stared at his old phone, scrolling through names he hadn't seen in years, until one stopped him cold. James Mitchell. Once they had been classmates, studying late into the night, sharing notes, and dreaming of becoming the kind of doctors who changed the world. James had made it, rising to head a pediatric transplant unit in another state. Antonio had not. But perhaps, after all these wasted years, James was his last hope. With shaking hands, Antonio dialed the number. It rang once, twice, then clicked. On the other end came a familiar voice, older now, but steady. "Antonio," James said, surprised. Memories rushed back, long nights of study, jokes shared in hospital corridors, and the day Antonio disappeared without a word. Antonio wasted no time with small talk. He explained everything: Isabella's condition, the refusal of the current hospital, his rare compatibility, and his desperation. James listened in silence before finally answering with words Antonio had been longing to hear. "Bring her here. We can do it. But you'll have to get her here fast. And Antonio, this is dangerous. For both of you." Antonio's chest tightened with a mix of fear and relief. There was hope, but hope laced with immense risk. He would have to reveal everything to Victoria, the woman who still saw him as nothing more than her driver. The thought alone made him hesitate. Yet, as he glanced at the hospital monitors, Isabella's weakening heartbeat spelling out her fate, he knew hiding was no longer an option. That evening, he approached Victoria with quiet determination. She sat slumped beside Isabella's crib, exhaustion carving lines into her face. "There's something you don't know about me," Antonio began, his voice steady though his hands trembled. Victoria's tired eyes flicked toward him, irritation mixing with grief. "What could you possibly have to say right now?" she snapped. But Antonio didn't flinch. He told her the truth, how he had once been a doctor, how prejudice had driven him from the profession, how he had kept his knowledge buried beneath a chauffeur's uniform for years. He confessed his connection to James Mitchell and that there was still a chance to save Isabella if they left immediately. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the steady hum of machines. Victoria's face was unreadable, caught between disbelief and outrage. Finally, her voice cracked. "You expect me to trust my daughter's life to a driver who suddenly claims to be a doctor?" Antonio met her gaze, unwavering. "No, I expect you to trust me as a man who has spent his life preparing for this moment. I have nothing to gain, only the chance to save her." The raw sincerity in his tone pierced the walls of doubt she had built, but still, fear held her. Isabella stirred weakly, her frail body reminding them both that time was running out. Antonio leaned closer, his voice lowering to a plea. "Give me 24 hours. If I fail, then condemn me. But don't let her die without trying." Victoria closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. At last, she whispered the words that would alter all their lives. 24 hours. The following morning, before the city fully woke, Antonio moved with precision. He transformed his sleek black car into something resembling a mobile ICU. The back seat was lined with cushions and medical supplies borrowed through quiet favors. An oxygen tank, a heart monitor, and emergency medication were strapped securely in place. Antonio's hands moved like those of the doctor he once was, every detail checked and rechecked. When Victoria arrived carrying Isabella, she froze at the sight of the vehicle. Her driver was gone. In his place stood a man radiating authority and skill. They set out just as the first rays of dawn painted the streets gold. The journey was long, the risks immense. Antonio drove with a surgeon's steadiness, one eye on the road, the other on Isabella's fragile vitals. Each time the monitor beeped irregularly, his hands darted back to adjust her oxygen or administer a dose, his calm efficiency belying the storm raging inside him. Victoria sat in the passenger seat, clutching her daughter's tiny hand, her eyes fixed on Antonio in a mixture of awe and fear. Every movement, every instruction he gave, revealed a side of him she had never imagined. Hours passed as the road stretched endlessly before them. At times, Isabella's breathing faltered, and Antonio's calm voice guided Victoria through the panic, teaching her how to assist, steadying her shaking hands. For the first time, she saw not a servant, but a man who carried both knowledge and unshakable devotion. The divide between them, wealth and status, power and servitude, blurred in the shared desperation of that journey. As night fell and the lights of James Mitchell's hospital finally appeared on the horizon, Antonio's grip tightened on the wheel. He had kept Isabella alive against the odds, but the greatest challenge still lay ahead. For Victoria, the disbelief that once clouded her judgment was gone. Watching Antonio command both the car and the fragile life of her child, she realized the truth. She was no longer entrusting her daughter to a driver, but to a doctor who had waited his whole life for this moment. The lights of St. Mary's Hospital gleamed with sterile precision as Antonio and Victoria arrived. Isabella cradled delicately in Antonio's arms, surrounded by the portable medical equipment that had become their lifeline. The pediatric transplant team, led by Dr. James Mitchell, was already prepared, their faces tense but professional, eyes flicking between monitors and the small patient they were about to save. Antonio handed Isabella over with the utmost care, his hands steady, every movement betraying the years of expertise hidden beneath the guise of a driver. For Victoria, the sight was surreal. The man she had dismissed for months was now at the center of a medical operation that could determine her daughter's very survival. Antonio scrubbed in beside Dr. Mitchell, slipping seamlessly into the rhythm of the operating room. His mind sharpened instantly, muscles moving with practiced precision. The years of waiting, of hiding his knowledge were now distilled into each incision, each careful suture. As the team began, the tension in the room was palpable. The risk was immense, Isabella's fragile body leaving no margin for error. Every movement counted, and Antonio's hands, once unseen and underestimated, guided each step with exacting care. The team watched, initially with surprise, as he suggested adjustments, referenced cross-matching details, and anticipated complications before they arose. 15 years of hidden skill shone through in every calculated motion. Flashbacks threatened to intrude as Antonio focused on the delicate task before him. He saw himself, years ago, sitting in lecture halls where professors doubted him, applying for residencies that vanished before his eyes, being rejected not for lack of skill, but for the color of his skin and the shape of his background. He remembered the humiliation, the quiet rage, the endless nights studying alone while opportunities passed by. But those memories fueled his hands now, each stitch a testament to the doctor he had always been, each careful maneuver a silent defiance against the system that had discarded him. The memory of Isabella's tiny chest rising and falling against the incubator in a distant hospital pressed him further. This was no longer about recognition. It was about life itself. Dr. Mitchell's voice broke the silence occasionally, coordinating instruments and assistants, but it was clear he was relying on Antonio as much as Antonio relied on him. The operation was long and meticulous. At each stage, Antonio's precision turned potential disaster into careful progress. Victoria, observing from the waiting area just beyond the operating room glass, felt a mixture of awe and guilt. She had spent months seeing only a driver, never pausing to consider the man behind the quiet eyes, the unwavering commitment, and the brilliance that had been obscured by circumstance and prejudice. Now, as she watched him assist in saving her child, the truth became undeniable. She had been blinded by assumptions, overlooking courage and competence that had been right in front of her all along. Hours crawled by, each minute a balance between hope and fear. Then, finally, Dr. Mitchell signaled the completion of the transplant. Isabella's small body, once dependent on the machines and tubes, now stabilized with steady breathing and vibrant color returning to her cheeks. The monitors beeped gently, indicating life sustained not by chance, but by skill and courage. Relief washed over Victoria in waves she could hardly contain. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the depth of the injustice she had unconsciously participated in, doubting the man who had risked everything for her daughter's life. Meanwhile, back at the original hospital, chaos erupted. Dr. Peterson and the neonatal ICU staff were in disbelief as they discovered Isabella had been moved without authorization. Calls flew between administrators, lawyers were contacted, and panic spread through the corridors of power that had dismissed Antonio's competence so easily. Legal departments scrambled to assess liability, while the specter of a lawsuit loomed over every official involved in the refusal to act when the child's life had been at stake. Their authority, once absolute, now trembled in the shadow of their prejudice. Victoria, now composed but firm, picked up the phone. Her voice, calm yet edged with authority, carried the weight of both grief and triumph. She instructed them to prepare for legal proceedings, defending Antonio's actions and emphasizing the critical reality. He had saved her child when those entrusted with that responsibility had failed. She reminded them that competence could not be measured by appearance or background, and that the law would see through their attempts to blame process over prejudice. Her resolve mirrored the transformation she had undergone, no longer a mother paralyzed by despair, but a woman emboldened by truth and gratitude. As Victoria hung up, she turned to Antonio, still in scrubs, hands steady even as exhaustion threatened to claim him. The child they had feared would not survive now slept peacefully, breathing on her own, free from the machines that had once dictated her life. Victoria finally saw him clearly, not as a driver, not as a subordinate, but as a man who had carried knowledge, courage, and love through years of injustice and hidden sacrifice. The operation had been more than a surgical success. It had shattered assumptions, challenged prejudice, and rewritten the boundaries of trust and respect. Antonio had not only saved Isabella, he had opened Victoria's eyes to the power of recognizing worth where society had told her to look away. 6 months had passed since that harrowing night, yet the memory of the struggle remained vivid for Victoria Hamilton. The mansion, once heavy with despair, now rang with laughter. Isabella, healthy and radiant, ran through the gardens with uncontainable energy, her rosy cheeks bouncing with every step, her laughter echoing through the once silent halls. Victoria watched from the terrace, her eyes softening as she realized how fragile life had been and how fiercely it had been protected. At her side stood Antonio Silva, no longer the unobtrusive driver who had quietly opened doors, but a man whose presence commanded respect. His white coat, crisp and clean, signaled the transformation he had undergone, not just in title but in recognition of his undeniable talent. Director of Pediatric Transplants at St. Mary's Hospital, Antonio now held a position that matched his skill, knowledge, and courage. The world, it seemed, had caught up to the truth that Victoria had only recently embraced. Newspapers and online headlines celebrated the extraordinary story. Black doctor disguised as driver saves millionaire's baby. From chauffeur to savior, Antonio Silva defies prejudice. And hospital rejects. Doctor rescues. A tale of courage. Each article recounted the years of invisible competence, the refusal of the original hospital to trust him, and the perilous journey to save Isabella's life. The media attention was relentless, but Antonio bore it with quiet dignity. For him, the accolades were not about fame. They were validation that the world could finally see what he had known all along, that skill, courage, and devotion are not determined by wealth, status, or skin color. Meanwhile, the hospital that had once dismissed him faced the consequences of its decisions. Lawsuits multiplied, alleging discrimination and malpractice, while administrators scrambled to defend policies that had allowed bias to override medical necessity. Dr. Peterson's name became synonymous with arrogance and prejudice, and the institution found itself under federal investigation. Their authority, once unquestioned, now trembled in the public eye, and the system they had relied upon to protect their hierarchy offered no shield. The contrast could not have been starker. Antonio, underestimated and discarded, had saved a life with skill and determination, while those who claimed expertise had failed. Victoria, having witnessed Antonio's unwavering commitment, had undergone her own transformation. She had been blinded by assumptions and social boundaries, failing to recognize the brilliance and dedication in the man she had only known as a driver. Standing beside him now, she felt the weight of her past prejudice. Yet, rather than shame, there was humility and gratitude. She had learned that true worth cannot be measured by appearance, and that sometimes the people society deems unremarkable are capable of extraordinary courage. Watching Antonio playfully chase Isabella through the garden, she realized that he had become far more than a savior. He was family. It was with that realization that Victoria made a decision that would change all their lives. One quiet afternoon, she approached Antonio, her expression serious yet filled with warmth. "Antonio," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "you have given Isabella life, love, and protection beyond what I could have imagined. I want you to be more than a hero to her. I want you to be her father, formally, legally. Will you accept?" Antonio's eyes widened for a moment, and then a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. Without hesitation, he took her hand, the weight of years of hidden struggle and sacrifice lifting in that single gesture. "Of course," he replied, his voice steady, joy resonating in every word. In that instant, Isabella's laughter carried an even deeper meaning. She now had a father chosen not by blood, but by unwavering love. Antonio reflected quietly in the evenings, the memories of 15 lost years pressing softly against the present. Years had been stolen from him by prejudice, by assumptions, and by a system blind to his competence. Yet, in the span of 6 months, he had gained something immeasurable. A daughter, recognition for his skills, and the chance to reshape a system that had once deemed him unworthy. His journey had been perilous, yet it had proven that courage, integrity, and devotion could triumph over bias, fear, and ignorance. Invitations arrived from universities, medical conferences, and advocacy groups, culminating in a prestigious request to speak at Harvard Medical School about systemic racism in medicine. Antonio accepted, not for fame or accolades, but to ensure that other brilliant minds, overlooked by circumstance and bias, would be given the chance to thrive. He would teach the next generation that competence knows no color, and that love and courage are the greatest forms of advocacy. As Isabella fell asleep in her new room, Antonio sat beside her, gently brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Victoria joined him, her hand resting on his shoulder, and together they watched the quiet rise and fall of her chest. He thought of the journey that had brought them here, the fear, the secrecy, the courage to defy a system that underestimated him. The greatest victories, he realized, often came not from those celebrated by society, but from the heroes it overlooked. Antonio had lost years hiding his truth, yet he had gained life, love, and the chance to change the world. In that serene moment, Antonio knew the story would be remembered not for the scandal or the headlines, but for what truly mattered, that true love, courage, and competence transcend color, class, and prejudice, that sometimes the people society disregards are the ones who rise to achieve the impossible, and that in the heart of a little girl named Isabella, Antonio Silva had not only found his purpose, but had rewritten the definition of heroism forever.